Hey folks, this story is a doozy. This was one of my favorite stories for really all of U.S. history. Um, it is pretty disturbing. It does involve some really strange stuff. There are, if you want to get deeper in depth into this, there are several true crime podcasts that cover this story. I originally ran across it probably back around 2002. I found a book about this guy, um, and it's just all kinds of craziness. So anyway, on to the story of our pal Carl von Cosel. Now, this goes on during the Great Depression. Our story starts around 1930. Um, and the book does, our textbook, American Yawp, does an excellent sort of a blow by blow view of the Great Depression. And this goes on, right after 1929. You've got the giant stock market crash. This happens, starts out in 1930, stretches into about 1938, 39. Uh, so, um, this guy, Carl von Cosel, he had originally been born in Germany. He moved to Austria for a little while, and in the 1920s, 1920s, yeah, 1920s, late 1920s, he ends up in Key West, Florida. And so this is one of the original Florida Man kind of stories. Uh, he claimed that he was a medical doctor, though he could never ever produce any sort of diplomas or any kind of documentation that he was a medical doctor. We're still kind of in that period where it's possible to apprentice to a medical doctor, and usually some other countries. The United States is very quickly getting into you go to a medical school, but we're not very far out of that period where you could just pop up and, hey, I studied with this other medical doctor and I'm a doctor too. Yay! Um, we're not too awful far out of that, so it's not super inconceivable to think that Carl had done so back in Austria or Germany. Possibly not, probably not. But he moves to Key West and he gets a job in the hospital, though. He gets a job as a radiologist. He does x-rays. He's an x-ray tech. Um, and Key West at the time, a lot of places in the United States at the time, has a really big problem with tuberculosis. And sadly, in Key West is the home for a lot of cigar production. And rolling cigars, what they would typically do, kind of Google some image of cigar rolling stations in Key West and you can get this, but you have these really long tables and everybody sits basically shoulder to shoulder and you roll cigars all day. Well, tuberculosis is a really neat disease that passes through respiratory issues. So breathing on somebody, coughing on somebody, when you exude all of these little uh, moist droplets from your breath that contain tuberculosis bacteria in them, you can spread tuberculosis. And when you're sitting shoulder to shoulder in a group of people like that, it's real easy. If somebody's got tuberculosis, you can spread it out real nice there. One of the cigar rollers is a young Elena Hoyos. And Elena is about 22 years old at the time. Carl's a dapper 56, I believe. Uh, anyway, Elena contracts tuberculosis, and when you get tuberculosis, you typically go for a chest X-ray, and that's how they assess. Even today, I think, partially do some other stuff today, but at the time, big way to assess the extent of the disease and the progression of the disease is to do a chest X-ray, and so she goes into the hospital and she's talking to her regular doctors. Her family's talking to her regular doctors. She's also going to meet Carl at the hospital because Carl does her chest x-rays. Um, And over time, Carl becomes very enamored with her. She just regards him as this, kind of weird dude that is very, very nice to her, but that's the extent. Carl, on the other hand, has built this up into this is the love of my life, this wonderful woman that I'm going to spend forever with. Um, and eventually, this is the 1930s. We don't have antibiotics. We won't have those for 15 more years. Uh, Elena is going to get to the point where her disease is absolutely terminal. Some people recover from tuberculosis, but a lot don't. So Elena's gotten to the point where her disease is terminal. Her doctors, her medical doctors tell her, hey, there's nothing really else that we can do other than kind of make you comfortable. We're going to engage in palliative care at this point. So she returns to her house. Her family and she are all very distraught that she is very much going to die very soon. Carl pops up. And Carl says, hey, I've got these other methods that I can possibly cure her. And he, electrocutes her and stuff like that and does all kinds of stuff that's not going to work, but he is trying some different stuff. The family, out of desperation, allows him to do so. But Elena still dies. And again, he's built this up in his head that, Elena is the love of his life and they're going to spend forever together. And now, his cherished loved one has died. Uh, Carl has money though. And he offers to purchase a mausoleum for Elena to be buried in the Key West Cemetery. The family is okay with this, and Elena's put in this mausoleum. Carl, every night, goes to the mausoleum after work and spends several hours at the mausoleum with Elena. At some point, Carl says that he hears Elena talking to him from the grave. She's dead. Carl says he hears Elena speaking to him. He also later on says that Elena has appeared before him and has been singing him a ballad. And there's a really famous ballad, Spanish ballad called La Boda Negra, the Black Wedding. And it's about this young lady. She dies and her spirit returns and continues to court this young gentleman that was her fiance, and they eventually get married in the song. You know, Elena's appearing before Carl, and she's singing this song about this dead lady that returns and gets married to some guy. And so Carl says, "Yeah, that sounds good to me." And so one night he pops into the Key West Cemetery with a little red wagon, and he loads Elena up into the little red wagon, and they head to the house. And Carl is going to live with Elena for the next 7 years. The family's, hey, Elena's buried in this, is inside this mausoleum. She's not buried. And so they don't really notice anything different. It's just that Carl has moved on. He's gotten beyond his grief. And so he's not showing up at the cemetery anymore. And so, like I said, he lives with her for the next 7 years. Uh, the next 7 years are filled with him. He goes to work. He's very diligent about going to work every day. But he also is doing a couple things at the house. One, he's preserving Elena. He actually, for somebody that's just kind of winging this, he does a really good job of preservation of this dead body. Um, if you want, they are kind of disturbing, but if you want to see some pictures of Carl's work, just Google Elena Hoyos or Carl von Cosel, do a Google image search, and you can see some images of Elena after she was discovered over at Carl's house. Um, Carl's a very solitary person. He goes to work and then he goes home. He doesn't really spend a lot of time socializing with the rest of the public down there in Key West. And it is a small community. It's the 1930s, and so it's not as touristy like it is today. Um, and so it's a small community. Everybody kind of knows each other's business. Well, one of Elena's sisters sees Carl sometimes inside his house at night with the curtains drawn. Carl's in there dancing with somebody. um, and Carl was in there dancing with Elena. Uh, and she gets suspicious, and I think there's a couple of other things I can't remember right now, but I think there's a couple of other things that tip her off even more. So she calls the police, and the police come over and search Carl's house, and they find Elena. And Elena is dressed in wedding clothes. She's in a white dress, and Elena's in Carl's bed. So Carl's going to be arrested. um, Carl is arrested. The charge is desecration of a grave. You can't break into a mausoleum and steal a body. That tends to be illegal. So Carl's charged with desecration of a grave, and he goes on trial. Okay, and we'll get back with Carl here in a second. Elena, though, like I said, Elena is very, very well preserved. If you've seen some images of Vladimir Lenin, after Lenin died during the Communist Revolution in Russia and then switching to the Soviet Union, his body is preserved and is kept in Red Square for, I'm not even sure if he's still there. He may still be there. But I know that all the way up through the 90s at least, Vladimir Lenin, he died in the 1930s, was preserved and kept in Red Square, preserved all the way up until at least the 90s, and he may still be there. I think he is. Maybe Google that. But Carl does a pretty good job of preserving Elena. And so the community of Key West, though, holds a second funeral for her. And if you if you Google some images here, you can see that the entire town of Key West turns out for her funeral. Newspaper reporters come down from the rest of the mainland, from the United States, to take pictures at this funeral. The story of what's happened goes nationwide. There are news reports all the way up in Montana and Washington State about what's going on in Key West with this weird, kind of crazy story. In Key West, school is closed that day. We are having a holiday. I want to make sure everybody, including the school children, can go to this funeral. And so this funeral home is absolutely packed. And if you look at some of these pictures of Elena's second funeral in the front row up near the casket, she has an open casket. There are some elementary school aged kids right there in the front row. So Elena has her second funeral. She is reburied somewhere in Key West Cemetery. She's going to have a secret burial. She has no headstone even today. The current, or well, at the time, the caretaker, the funeral home director of the Key West Funeral Home, they rebury her secretly. They know where she is, and they tell the next people that come in. You know, when the current caretaker retires, he tells the next person. So today, the current caretaker of the Key West Funeral Homes, they know where Elena's body is. She's buried somewhere on the grounds, but they're not going to tell anybody because she may kind of escape again. Or Carl may come back, who knows. Carl, though, goes on trial in Key West. Well, statute of limitations is going to kick in. Usually for a lot of crimes, if you commit a crime and a period of time goes by, usually the longest period is 7 years. Does not count for murder and some other stuff like that. But if you commit a crime and that amount of time goes by, you cannot be convicted of that crime. Well, Carl desecrated a grave a little over 7 years ago. And so when he's charged, statute of limitations has expired. And so Carl does not go to prison. He is his charges are going to be forced to be dropped. And then he moves to a different place, I think in Jupiter, Florida. Maybe, I'm not sure. But he dies in 1952. Weirdly and disturbingly, when Carl dies, He lives with his, I think it's either his sister or his wife. And uh, when she finds him dead, he kind of is very, very private. He keeps his room shut, and nobody's allowed to go in there. When she notices that he has died, and either her or the police go into his room, Carl has recreated another Elena doll. He's sort of made a death mask of her earlier, and has sort of recreated this doll, and so they're both in there together when he has died in 1952, and then he is buried up there wherever he dies. So, super, super strange story. Often gets overshadowed by the Great Depression, but some really, really major, major weirdness in American history going down on that one. So I will leave you with that. Next time we'll move into World War II.